The year is 1945. Japan's empire, once stretching from the jungles of Burma to the shores of the Pacific, is collapsing in flames. American B-29 bombers roar across the skies, dropping incendiaries that turn wooden cities into firestorms. Tokyo burns, Osaka smolders, Nagoya becomes ash. Survivors stumble through ruins, carrying what little food they can salvage: charred rice, dried roots, scraps of weeds plucked from roadside ditches. Government records show that by summer, rations in the capital had fallen to fewer than 1,500 calories a day, barely enough to survive. Yet amid this devastation, soldiers were told to endure. They were ordered to fight, not simply until wounded, not even until cornered, but until death. The Imperial Army preached the ancient warrior's creed of Bushidō, twisted into wartime propaganda. To surrender was unthinkable. Officers drilled their men relentlessly. Capture meant eternal shame, a stain on their families, a betrayal of the emperor. In training camps, recruits were handed leaflets declaring, "The moment you fall into enemy hands, you cease to be Japanese." Families of the captured were often erased from community records, forced to live under the shadow of disgrace. Diaries recovered of the war show that many soldiers carried a single grenade or bullet, not for the enemy, but for themselves, insurance against the unbearable dishonor of survival. And so, across the Pacific, Japanese troops fought with desperate ferocity. On Saipan, thousands of soldiers and civilians leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. On Iwo Jima, Marines described the eerie silence after battle, broken only by the explosions of soldiers detonating grenades against their chests. Death, they believed, was purification. Capture was corruption. The Japanese were taught to imagine Allied captivity as a nightmare beyond comprehension. Government broadcasts claimed that prisoners in American hands were tortured, starved, mutilated. They were said to live in cages like animals, stripped of humanity, beaten until they begged for death. This was the picture painted by Tokyo, one of barbaric Western cruelty, meant to steal the soldiers' resolve. But, as the tide of war turned, cracks began to appear in this propaganda. On remote islands, in jungles choked with humidity and disease, some soldiers found themselves too weak to die for glory. Starvation gnawed at them, wounds festered, exhaustion crushed the will for ritual suicide. And so, a small number were captured alive, ragged, half-mad with hunger, expecting torment at the hands of their enemies. What they discovered instead stunned them. American reports describe prisoners trembling violently when handed water, as though expecting poison. Others collapsed to their knees, begging for a swift execution. But no execution came. Instead came bandages, food, even cigarettes. And among the rations distributed in certain camps, there appeared something so alien to their suffering that it seemed like sorcery: the glossy wrapper of a Hershey chocolate bar. For men who had not tasted sugar in years, the sweetness was incomprehensible. Soldiers raised on meager rice rations stared at the silver wrapper as though it contained treasure stolen from another world. Some bit cautiously, convinced it was a trick. Others wept openly when the rich taste spread across their tongues. The paradox was unbearable. How could the same enemy who burned their cities also give them chocolate? How could those who rained fire upon their homeland offer kindness in captivity? Was this generosity, or was it a cruel weapon designed to unravel their spirit? This was the beginning of a deeper fracture not only in military morale, but in the very worldview the Japanese army had built upon Bushidō and loyalty to the emperor. A world where surrender was worse than death now confronted a new truth, wrapped in silver foil. And so, amid the ashes of empire, a paradox emerged, one of brutality and mercy, destruction and sweetness. A paradox that would haunt every prisoner who tasted it, and one that would echo long after the war was over. In the quiet of a Japanese barracks, before dawn patrols and battlefield chaos, recruits were made to kneel on wooden floors while officers thundered words older than the empire itself. They spoke of Bushidō, the way of the warrior, a code that had bound the samurai for centuries. In its purest form, It demanded loyalty, courage, and death before dishonor. By the 20th century, this code was no longer just philosophy. It had been weaponized into a doctrine of war. Government pamphlets printed in the 1940s carried chilling words: "Captured soldiers are no longer Japanese." Families were told that any son who surrendered ceased to exist, as if his name and blood had been cut from the family register. In classrooms, school children were taught that death was beautiful, surrender was shameful, and loyalty to the emperor outweighed life itself. The message was clear: survival in enemy hands was worse than suicide. On the front lines, this creed was carried in pockets. Many soldiers kept a single bullet or a hand grenade, not for combat, but for themselves. Testimonies from Iwo Jima reveal diaries filled with grim vows. To die is honor. To surrender is to abandon the emperor. On Saipan, entire battalions chose mass suicide, grenades pressed to chests, mothers clutching children as they leapt from cliffs. American Marines, hardened by combat, were left stunned by the spectacle. Yet, for all the fervor, war had its own cruel mathematics. Hunger gnawed at the body, exhaustion broke the will. Soldiers who collapsed from starvation, or who lay wounded beyond their strength, sometimes found themselves taken alive. But for these men, captivity was no reprieve. They were haunted by the certainty that their captors would humiliate, torture, or kill them slowly. This fear was no accident. Japanese propaganda described Allied camps cages of torment. Radio broadcasts claimed that prisoners were mutilated, burned, or experimented on. Soldiers were told that Americans treated captives like animals, stripping them naked, feeding them swill, and leaving them to die in filth. Under this shadow, surrender seemed a fate far worse than death. And yet, the truth was stranger. Those who entered Allied custody discovered not cages but barracks, not executioners but medics. They were handed water, bandages, and food. In some camps, they even wrote letters home, an act they thought impossible, for they had been declared dead in the eyes of their own nation. Still, the weight of indoctrination did not lift easily. Many POWs refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned. Others wept uncontrollably when they realized their lives had been spared. The cultural chasm was vast, and in that space, every act of kindness became magnified. Without understanding this code of no surrender, the shock of captivity cannot be understood. And without that weight of indoctrination, the sweetness of what would come, the unthinkable gift of chocolate, would have carried no meaning at all. Because before the sweetness came the collapse. Before the candy came the shattering of an empire's most sacred law. The first steps into captivity were always the most terrifying. Japanese soldiers, dragged from jungles or carried bleeding from foxholes, crossed an invisible threshold from the world of Bushidō and certain death into the custody of men they had been told were demons. American military reports from Guadalcanal describe one such moment in stark detail. A half-starved private, no more than 19, stumbled from the undergrowth with his uniform in tatters, his lips cracked from dehydration. Dropping to his knees, he pressed his forehead into the mud, whispering pleas for execution. He believed the end would come swiftly, perhaps by bayonet. Instead, a Marine handed him a canteen of clean water. The young soldier drank in disbelief, his hands shaking as though the liquid itself was poisoned. Scenes like this repeated across the Pacific. On Saipan, on Okinawa, in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, captured Japanese troops braced for torture that never arrived. To their astonishment, many were treated according to the Geneva Conventions, a code of international law Japan itself had refused to ratify. American camps, though sometimes improvised in the chaos of war, often included wooden barracks, medical wards staffed with doctors, and even Red Cross inspections. In Australia, camps at Cowra and Hay were established with organized living quarters, kitchens, and infirmaries. In Hawaii, prisoners were given work duties and sometimes allowed supervised recreation. By 1944, some were even transported across the ocean to camps in the continental United States, where fields of farmland replaced the ruined jungles they had left behind. For soldiers raised on starvation diets, the shock was immediate. Prisoners were issued rations of bread, meat, and vegetables, quantities unimaginable in Japan's crumbling supply system. American guards sometimes shared cigarettes, their smoke curling in the tropical air like a gesture of impossible camaraderie. In some camps, radios played American jazz or swing, sounds so foreign that they seemed like music from another planet. But the treatment was not universally gentle. Guards, hardened by brutal combat and scarred by the atrocities committed against WWII POWs in Japanese custody, could be ruthless. Beatings were not unheard of, and attempted escapes were punished severely. Yet even with discipline, the underlying conditions were humane compared to the nightmare Japanese propaganda had promised. The cultural shock deepened as prisoners discovered unexpected luxuries. At a camp in Hawaii, a library stocked with English books sat open to those willing to learn. Baseball games were organized on dusty fields, a strange irony given Japan's own passion for the sport. Work details provided not only activity but wages, small sums. Yes, but wages nonetheless, paid by the enemy who was supposed to strip them of dignity. Every detail clashed with their indoctrination. The enemy was supposed to be barbaric. Yet here, in captivity, they encountered not cages of torment, but something resembling sanctuary. It was not paradise. Discipline was strict, surveillance constant, and shame unrelenting, but it was survival. And then came the smallest, most bewildering detail of all. Among the rations, sometimes tucked alongside canned meat or biscuits, appeared items that seemed utterly alien to men who had survived on millet and weeds: glossy cigarettes, polished cutlery, and in certain camps, the silver-wrapped glimmer of chocolate. If survival itself was shocking, then this was unthinkable. Sweetness offered by the enemy, a taste that would soon fracture everything they had been taught to believe. The first encounter with sweetness was almost unbearable. Military records and eyewitness accounts describe Japanese prisoners staring, wide-eyed, at the foreign object in their hands, a small, rectangular bar wrapped in silver foil and brown paper. To them, it looked less like food and more like contraband, an artifact from another universe. Some clutched it tightly, unwilling to open it, as though the wrapper itself carried value greater than life. Others tore it carefully, suspicious, convinced it might conceal poison. For years, their bodies had known only scarcity. Rations in the Imperial Army were meager boiled rice, millet, or, in desperate times, weeds and roots scavenged from the jungle. On retreating islands, starvation became routine. Soldiers gnawed on bark, hunted lizards, and drank muddy water to survive. To a man conditioned by hunger, the sight of chocolate was unthinkable. Then came the first bite. Veterans recall the moment vividly, how hardened men wept when sweetness spread across their tongues. One prisoner later admitted it was the first time in his life he had tasted chocolate. Another described the sensation as so overwhelming he thought it must be a trick. Yet the candy was real, and it was offered freely, without condition. For Americans, this was routine. The U.S. military had long recognized the morale-boosting power of sugar. Hershey's produced millions of chocolate rations, some standard bars, others designed as high-calorie D-bars for soldiers in the field. To Allied troops, these were simple comforts. To Japanese prisoners, they were revelations of abundance, symbols of a society where food was plentiful enough to sweeten war. The impact went beyond taste. Military intelligence officers reported the psychological shock. Many POWs struggled to reconcile their indoctrination with the reality before them. They had been told the enemy was barbaric, inhuman, merciless. Yet here, the Americans not only gave them food and medical care, but luxuries. Chocolate became more than candy, it was propaganda in its purest, most irresistible form. In interrogation reports, some prisoners admitted their confusion openly. "If this is the enemy," one remarked, "then what have we been told all this time?" The chocolate bar, a trivial object in American eyes, shattered years of military conditioning in a single instant. But the gesture carried deeper implications. Sweetness symbolized indulgence, comfort, even decadence, the very things Imperial Japan had denied its soldiers in favor of sacrifice and austerity. Each bite reminded them of what they lacked not only as prisoners, but as citizens of an empire, collapsing under the weight of war. What the Japanese military used fear to conceal, the Americans revealed with sugar. It was a weapon more subtle than a rifle, more devastating than a bomb. A single taste of the unthinkable raised a dangerous question. If the enemy offered kindness, then what had their leaders stolen from them? And in that question lay the quiet erosion of faith in the empire itself. The shock did not end with the first meal or the first taste of chocolate. What awaited Japanese soldiers in American POW camps was something far stranger, a rhythm of daily life that resembled order, even dignity. For men who had marched through jungles on empty stomachs, expecting death at every turn, the routines of camp existence felt almost surreal. Reports from facilities in Hawaii describe scenes difficult to imagine amid the Pacific War. Barracks were organized, work details assigned with military precision. Prisoners were given uniforms, blankets, even access to medical wards. In some camps, classrooms were opened where POWs studied English, agriculture, or even mathematics. To men who had been taught that capture meant dishonor, it was a daily confrontation with an impossible reality. The enemy was not torturing them, but teaching them. Leisure, too, became part of this strange captivity. Baseball diamonds were carved into camp yards, and games played under the watch of American guards. The irony was not lost. Baseball had taken root in Japan decades earlier, a cultural bridge now resurfacing in captivity. Prisoners sang songs, tended vegetable gardens, and in some cases received small payments for their labor. For men raised on the ethos of sacrifice, the idea of being paid by the enemy bordered on the absurd. Yet these camps were no utopia. Guards remained strict. Red Cross inspections noted punishments for escape attempts, and accounts reveal that some local civilians harbored deep resentment toward the Japanese captives, seeing in them the faces of those who had killed sons and brothers overseas. The shadow of war lingered at every gate. Still, compared to the conditions inflicted by Japan upon alive prisoners, the starvation, forced marches, and brutal beatings, the contrast was staggering. The Geneva Conventions, often ignored in the Pacific theater, were at least partially upheld in these camps. Regular rations were distributed, and medical care was documented. Survival was not only possible, it came with dignity. Letters home became another weapon of compassion. With a light approval, Japanese POWs were permitted to write to their families, reassuring them of their survival. For men whose government had already declared them dead the moment they surrendered, these letters were like ghosts returning to life. One American officer remarked that the simple act of posting mail caused more disbelief among prisoners than any battlefield miracle. And then there were the small luxury cigarettes passed out during roll call, radios humming with American music, the occasional sweet tucked into a ration pack. Each one chipped away at the iron wall of propaganda they had grown up with. How could a nation said to be barbaric allow such comforts? Daily life in the enemy's camp was not paradise. It was a contradiction, a world suspended between harsh military order and startling humanity. For the prisoners, every sunrise revealed a truth more destabilizing than battle, that their greatest enemy had given them back not only life, but glimpses of freedom itself. American rifles had not broken them. Hunger, disease, and relentless bombing had not broken them. What shattered many Japanese soldiers in captivity was something far more subtle: kindness. Diaries recovered from camps describe a torment far deeper than wounds of flesh. One prisoner scrawled, "The enemy feeds me. Why, my emperor does not know I am alive. My family believes I am gone. Am I still Japanese?" These words capture the dissonance that rippled through thousands of men who had been raised to believe surrender erased their very existence. The Bushidō creed, once unshakable, crumbled in silence. Officers had drilled into their troops that captivity meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here, in barracks across Hawaii, Australia, and America, captives were not beaten, but clothed, not starved, but nourished. How could this be reconciled with the image of the barbaric enemy painted in military propaganda for many? It could not. Intelligence reports reveal that some POWs spiraled into despair, unable to accept survival itself. Others, however, adapted with astonishing speed. They marveled at American abundance rows of canned food, cigarettes handed out casually, libraries open to them. Some even began to study English, curious about the world beyond Japan's crumbling empire. American intelligence officers were quick to exploit this psychological fracture. Prisoners, once terrified of speaking, began to reveal troop movements, supply routes, and morale inside the Imperial Army. A few were recruited to broadcast radio messages urging Japanese soldiers to surrender. Their voices transmitted across battlefronts where their comrades still fought to the death. The unthinkable had happened. Loyalty, once absolute, was negotiable. The smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. The clink of cutlery in a camp cafeteria, the sweetness of chocolate melting on the tongue, these were not luxuries, but weapons of ideology. They proved, in a language more powerful than propaganda, that Japan had denied the soldiers not only comfort, but truth itself. Yet the collapse of faith brought new terrors. What would happen when these men returned home? In Japan, surrender was still synonymous with disgrace. Families often received notices declaring captured soldiers effectively dead. To return alive was not a triumph, but a stigma. Some POWs confessed in diaries that they dreaded freedom more than captivity, fearing the shame awaiting them in a homeland still burning with pride and defeat. Thus, the true battle was fought not on Pacific beaches, but inside the minds of men, between loyalty and survival, between indoctrination and reality, between the shadow of an emperor who demanded death and the taste of chocolate that whispered of life. And so the question lingered, sharp as any blade, when the war finally ended, would these men step back into Japan as sons of the nation or as strangers marked forever by the unthinkable mercy of their enemies? The ships creaked into Japanese harbors carrying men who were not supposed to exist. They had been declared lost in action, erased from family registers, mourned in ceremonies, as though already dead. Yet now, in late 1945 and 1946, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war stepped back onto home soil. Their nation was unrecognizable. Tokyo smoldered in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki glowed with the ghostly scars of atomic fire, and American soldiers marched openly through the streets. But the devastation of the land was nothing compared to the devastation of identity. To return alive from captivity was not celebrated, it was condemned. Families who had hung portraits of their sons on household altars sometimes refused to recognize them. In villages across Japan, mothers wept not from joy, but from shame, whispering, "Better, he had died an honorable death." Captivity had stripped these men of their place in society. Many expos learned to live in silence. Diaries and oral histories reveal how they concealed their past, pretending they had been laborers or displaced civilians. The stigma was crushing. Even in post-war censuses, former prisoners often refused to record their captivity, fearful of social ostracism. A handful took their own lives rather than endure the label of dishonor. And yet, within this silence lay memories too vivid to erase. Men who had been fed on boiled weeds in Pacific jungles could still taste the sweetness of an American chocolate bar. They remembered the hum of radios in prison barracks, the laughter of baseball games in camps, the strange courtesy of guards who follow the Geneva Conventions. Oral testimonies recorded decades later often return to the same moment, the shock of realizing that the enemy, portrayed as demonic, could treat them with humanity. For some, this revelation became transformative. It planted quiet seeds of doubt about the militarism that had driven Japan into catastrophe. Historians note that many expos, though silent in public, supported Japan's new pacifist constitution, seeing in it a shield against the madness they had once served. The humiliation of capture slowly evolved into a private conviction. Never again should loyalty to authority demand blind sacrifice. But for others, captivity remained a wound that never healed. They carried the shame like a shadow, even as Japan rebuilt into a modern nation. At reunions decades later, some veterans still refused to admit their time in Allied camps, while others broke down in tears, recalling the kindness of an enemy who had upended everything they believed. The chocolate bar, small and unremarkable, lingered as a haunting symbol. For men raised in a world of ration rice and military slogans, its sweetness was unforgettable not because it was indulgence, but because it was proof. Proof that the empire had lied, proof that survival could coexist with dignity. Proof that war is not fought only with bullets and bombs, but with the fragile, devastating power of perception. And as these men faded into history, one question remained: did captivity steal their honor, or did it reveal a truth their nation could never bear to face? Japanese military records from the late war years describe a nation starving. Soldiers survived on millet, pine bark, even grass. By 1945, rice, the very soul of the Japanese diet, had all but vanished. And then, in the silence of prisoner of war camps, came a taste of the unthinkable: chocolate. At first, it seemed like an illusion. Prisoners eyed the dark squares suspiciously, certain they concealed poison. Propaganda back home had warned that Westerners were monsters who devoured human flesh. How could they offer sweetness? But, as the chocolate melted, bitter and rich, disbelief turned into an even more dangerous realization: the enemy had more than Japan could ever hope to provide. This was no accident. Years before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. War Department had commissioned Hershey to create a durable ration bar for soldiers. The deer ashen weighed 4 ounces, packed 600 calories, and was engineered to withstand tropical heat. Soldiers hated its taste: dense, bitter, almost waxy. But in the eyes of a starving prisoner, it was miraculous, and miracles spread quickly. Survivors later recalled how whispers of chocolate, of white bread, even of coffee circulated through the camps. Each story clashed with the empire's promises of honor and sacrifice. If the Allies had enough to feed prisoners luxuries, what did that say about Japan's desperate ration lines back home? Historians now see this as food turned into propaganda. Whether intentional or not, the Allies wielded abundance as a weapon. Mercy itself became strategy. To give sweetness while wielding overwhelming power was not weakness, it was dominance. The chocolate bar was no longer just sugar and cocoa. It was a silent verdict, an edible confession of Japan's defeat. And for the men who tasted it, the memory would remain a forbidden sweetness forever tied to surrender. In the ruins of post-war Japan, memories clung not only to the thunder of bombs or the cries of the wounded, but to something far smaller, far stranger a taste. Survivors of captivity would speak of it in hushed tones, their voices caught between disbelief and longing. It was not steel, not fire, not blood, it was chocolate. For men raised under the iron weight of Bushidō, the experience was unsettling. Diaries recovered in the 1950s reveal the same refrain: how could the enemy give us sweetness? This single question haunted veterans for decades. The war had been framed as a sacred struggle, the Americans cast as demons without mercy. Yet in the barbed wire silence of POW camps, the enemy's first offering had not been cruelty, it had been kindness. Historians point out that this contradiction struck deeper than hunger. To taste chocolate was to taste abundance, to witness proof that Japan's empire had lied. Some veterans later described it as betrayal not by the Americans, but by their own leaders, who had promised glory while delivering starvation. Others saw it as the first flicker of doubt that would later feed Japan's pacifist conscience. Oral histories capture the strange mixture of gratitude and shame. One former POW recalled weeping alone after his first bite, ashamed that his tears were not for fallen comrades, but for sugar melting on his tongue. Another admitted he hid his memories for decades, fearing his family would see him as weak for accepting kindness from the enemy. The chocolate bar endured as more than food. It became a symbol of contradiction, sweetness wrapped in defeat, tenderness born from destruction. And like an aftertaste that lingers long after the meal, its memory haunted a generation.